Again, we start our talk first by answering a question, and you only have 2 to 3 minutes, like very, very briefly, to answer this question, and afterwards we can get into our discussion. So, the question that I have for you is, what is the most important technological trend in the field of charging infrastructure in the US that we're going to be seeing develop in the next 5 years? So why don't we just go in the order of seats? So Harmeet, you're up next to answer that briefly.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me here. And it's actually it's difficult to pick one technology trend because we're experiencing convergence of sort of mobility and energy revolution. And there are a lot of technology trends at play, all the way from autonomy to distributed energy resources to distributed computing, distributed ledgers, and technologies that are driving shared economy. But I think one technology that will continue to trend for many years is the grid edge technology that enables grid-connected smart EV infrastructure and enables deployment of this infrastructure at a large scale and enables vehicle-to-grid communication. The number of EVs are increasing on the road. The battery sizes are increasing, but the charging durations, there's a pressure on the charging durations to go down. And what that does is it creates additional, a significantly higher peak for the grid. And these are the technologies that we can use to convert these challenges for our grid into opportunities. By lowering the cost of infrastructure deployment and unlocking and enabling additional value from the EV load as a resource and an asset for the grid.
All right, thank you very much for that. And Obrie.
Hi, so like Harmeet, I also had a hard time just picking one technology. I kind of looked at things from a slightly different perspective, really looking at that end driver, that end user. And really what I believe needs to happen in order for us to be able to reach mass EV adoption for all is that charging needs to be as convenient as the fueling of an internal combustion engine vehicle. And so home is definitely part of this equation. I actually think that home is more convenient than going to a gas station. Digitalization is also a big part of this equation, really making sure that end EV driver can easily find and access stations in a seamless manner. However, I truly believe that for us to have that mass adoption, there needs to be a proliferation in the United States of high-powered DC fast chargers. And when I say this, I actually mean two things: both the actual number of stations and sites and the speed of charge. And just to give you guys a little bit of background about myself, I first started in this industry in 2011. I was really on the fast charger deployment side of things. And at that time, we actually thought that 50 kilowatt fast charging was just, I mean, it was like so, insanely fast. A 30-minute dwell time was just kind of beyond, what we could even think about, right? And now we're starting to see 150 kW, and we're starting to see 350 kW really starting to roll out. And while I know there's very few cars right now that can accept that type of power, they are coming, and that is going to greatly increase user experience. Imagine when you can now charge your car in a quarter, a third, or a much quicker time. And so this combined, when really looking a little more holistically and including the car, with the expectation that electric cars are going to continue to evolve, we're going to continue to see bigger and more efficient, batteries. We're already starting to see, 60 kilowatt-hour batteries that are rolling out and affordable. 90 are starting to come. This really starts to put electric cars and EV range and convenience on par with internal combustion engine cars. And I believe this really removes one of the biggest barriers. Just to quickly address the numbers of some of the infrastructure that is coming to the US, we have Electrify America, who's going to roll out $2 billion in infrastructure. And Cycle cycle 1 alone, this means an additional 350 sites, and there's 4 cycles like this over the next 10 years. In California, where I'm from, we have an additional $1 billion coming in for infrastructure, and that's both through state and utility programs. And then the last thing I want to address is that I live in San Francisco, where 80% of us live in what we call multi-unit dwellings, which is an apartment or a condo. And so one of the things that are starting to happen in more urban areas as well is that we're starting to see plazas of DC fast chargers coming in as a potential solution to solving that problem of, I want to drive an EV, but I don't have any place to plug it in. So just to quickly conclude, I believe that when there's convenient, easily accessible, and truly fast charging out there, this is going to be one of the greatest enablers to EV adoption.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Rajit Gadh.
Thank you. I think that, so I'm a professor at UCLA and also the director of the Smart Grid Energy Research Center. We work very closely with the electric vehicle manufacturing companies, with electric grid operators, with site hosts and so forth. And so the slide you see up there really shows you essentially the key constituents bringing together electric cars, the site host, solar panels into a location. And now the slide that's up there shows you some of the innovations that are coming out of our labs. What am I excited about? I'm excited about, first of all, something I'm excited about, it's called smart EV charging, in which you plug your car in and somebody out there, some software program out there, understands and knows what you're doing. So that's something that we're working on in UCLA. We have 250 EV charging stations installed in 2 utilities, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and Southern California Edison. So the idea of smart EV charging is not just to make EV charging friendly to the driver, but then also by way of aggregation of EV charging stations with multiple different sort of types of vehicles and different types of requirements of EV drivers with different sites so that you can aggregate at that level to provide increasing value that is available through grid operators. So the idea is to integrate grid operators to site hosts to EV drivers. So that's the second thing. The third thing that I'm very interested in Southern California and even Northern California, and you can see 4 of us are from California, guys, we cannot represent the US, I'm so sorry, but so we have this issue, we have a lot of solar that's coming in. So we're gonna have what's called solar duck curve, that means over generation of sun in the afternoon. How can you use EV charging, smart EV charging, to absorb excess solar energy? So that's the third thing. The last thing I'm very excited about is what's called vehicle to grid, in which you can use the car as an energy storage device and send it back to the grid. So these are not just my crystal ball. These are 4 pilot projects and research projects that we've been working on now, and a couple of them are actually being commercialized by our students and making their way into the real world. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So more than one technological trend, but we can't leave things out. And you, Eric Bach from Lucid Motors, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, at Lucid, we have not only created a beautiful all-electric Lucid Air. The Lucid Air will be unlocking the full potential of electrification to our customer base. And next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Is there a clicker?
It's over there.
One more?
One more?
Back.
Or you can, would you like to just maybe pass the clicker over?
Yeah, the Lucid Air will have best-in-class luxury space and an intuitive user experience. Plug and charge and the ability to use it as an energy source will help define convenience, economics, and sustainability. The Lucid Air will integrate into people's homes via the Lucid Home Energy Management System and also into smart grids. And we at Lucid believe that the most important technological trend in charging is integrating our EVs into the smart energy storage ecosystem. Thanks.
All right, so thank you very, very much. This is the third sort of look at EV charging in different regions. So why don't we begin by doing a little bit of compare and contrast. If I may begin with you, Harmeet, because your company is a big player in the US charging infrastructure market and has been so for some time. I do assume you were listening to the other panels about China and about Europe. How does the US compare to European and Chinese markets?
Yeah, I think one of the key differences is how these markets are regulated. The US is much further along in deregulation of unbundling of transmission and generation and distribution. Europe, especially Germany and China, have probably maybe a significantly bigger problem with the managing of wind generation, integrating wind generation with where the load is, because the wind farms and wind generation is established far away from where the load factors are. So as the EV proliferation increases, it's probably there will be a need to invest in additional transmission lines to address grid congestion. And in Asia especially also is it's booming energy demand overall. And I think there's also a different maturity level of smart grid across different places in Asia. So they, in some way, also have an advantage to leapfrog technology over there.
Aubrey, did you want to add something to that?
Yes. So when I first started working for Hubject, I had no idea what an EMP and a CPO was. In the US, our roles are much less defined. And so we have very few CPOs. I can't really think of any that aren't an EMP, meaning touching the end customer. So I think that's a little bit different. However, I do feel that in some ways, when it comes to e-mobility, again, really looking at that end, driver and really that seamless charging experience, that Europe is in some ways ahead. And so some of the trends that I actually see happening in the US is I do think that there's going to be additional market players. And when I say that, I mean auto OEMs, utilities, some of those guys who are really going to want to start owning that end customer. And so I do think we are going to see some of them, becoming EMPs. I do think this is going to bring some disruption to the market. However, I think if you really start to look at the economics of actually owning and operating stations themselves, margins are really thin. And so I think that if you make your money in other ways, whether it's selling a vehicle, mobility services, electricity or electrons, that it's more economically sustainable.
I'd like to then just ask you, Eric, because Lucid Motors is a pretty exciting newcomer to the electric vehicle market, and I mean the cars look very beautiful, and I think you mentioned yourself the company has a real commitment to its customers. So what is your company's approach to charging, and how does charging integrate into the experience of the Lucid Air car?
Right. There are two aspects in our feeling to that topic. Number one is the user experience, that we want to be absolutely lucid. So a branded experience, very user-friendly, plug-and-charge capability. As I mentioned, integration into a home energy management system, all branded by Lucid. The other topic is, since electric mobility has now found a broader adoption and there are many, many players investing in the infrastructure, we don't see it as a core need for us actually to roll out our own infrastructure. Therefore, we've been participating quite actively in the CCS and Charin initiative, and we will partner with infrastructure providers on that field.
All right, so you mentioned the infrastructure providers, that you're going to partner with them and not really have to see it as your own task. You're going to focus on your cars and your customers. I did read that just last week, in fact, 3 states in the US have announced massive investments in charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. So it's California, my home state of New York, and New Jersey. Together, the 3 of them are going to put $1.3 billion on the table. I mean, it's amazing. It's really, really incredible. Just how significant is this for the US as a whole? Are we going to see more states sort of follow suit? I mean, maybe not with this kind of, this level of investment, but at least sort of following this example. Who would like to tackle this question first? Sure.
I think it's very interesting. I think you have to look at what's going on. And I think you have to look at starting from the customer experience, electric vehicle. The first time I drove electric vehicle was a BMW Mini, the limited series. And I drove it, and they capped me out at 90 miles per hour. I couldn't go more than 90 miles. And so that was disappointing. But I'll tell you, the people who were sitting with me, they were quite amazed as to the experience driving on Highway 405 in Los Angeles, California, in the middle of the night, because you know, Highway 405 is jammed from 5 a.m. till midnight. But the customer experience with driving an electric car is something people forget. And you know, when I got my first electric car, I got my electric Nissan Leaf, and then Tesla, I'm on the 3rd Tesla. Once you sit in that car, then you just, there's completely different dynamics. And so I think that people are talking to each other, and there's a grassroots movement. We saw that in UCLA. Our lab installed the first charging station. People congregated by the charging station. They started driving the vehicle. There's a grassroots movement. And I think people forget about that. It's the vehicle, the excitement, the joy, the fun, the quiet ride. It's not for everyone, right? Some people want a big SUV, but then, which is okay, and nothing wrong. I mean, you want everything. So I think that something is happening. It's a grassroots movement. People don't realize it. And you look at the Tesla shareholders meeting. You see, look at, it reminds me of the Apple, the old Apple, right? When Steve Jobs used to go. So there's this whole excitement especially in California. 40% of all electric cars in America are in California. And so I argued, but now other states, New York, New Jersey, Georgia is big, other states are picking up. And so I think this is going to be a very, very big phenomenon in the US.
Aubrey?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add to that is I believe the monies that you're referring to are coming from the utilities. And again, it's that whole, I think they really do want to start owning and operating charging stations where they can. There is regulation in some places, so they can't necessarily across the board. But I really think that the energy companies now, this is on their radar, and they want to start owning that end customer. So.
I'd like to actually talk a bit more about that,
Okay.
because so of those 3 states, then it's not surprising that it's California that's making the biggest investment. It alone is putting down $768 million for EV infrastructure. So it's the 3 largest utilities that are putting this money forward. Why? Like, what do they have to gain in taking the risk and investing so much money? Because, okay, there's growing excitement about driving electric vehicles, as you say, but it's still relatively slow, can we say? This is sort of a gradual growth. Does it make sense to invest so much in the infrastructure first?
Yeah, I mean, utilities and regulators for quite some time were not really in the US, not in favor of investing in infrastructure, because they didn't want to spend ratepayer money in something that was perceived to only provide benefit to very few people. So that perception has changed, and it's now established that EVs are going mainstream, and there's been a significant uptake of electric vehicles. So now regulators are approving investment and pilot projects. California, you mentioned, the 3 big IOUs are now heavily invested and have active pilot projects going on. New York Power Authority has committed to up to $250 million in their Evolve initiative. PSEG, I think, has committed another $300 million to develop smart grid-connected EV infrastructure, and in Ohio recently, PUC approved another $10 million. So utilities definitely are in the right position to facilitate the mass and the large-scale deployment of the infrastructure, and also in a way that's equitable, because they're also well-positioned to deploy and help proliferate electric transportation and mobility in disadvantaged communities, which historically have been subject to higher level of pollution based on their locations, usually close to or next to motorways and freeways. So so that's certainly a big social angle to it. And on the other hand, with the energy efficiency, the revenues are going down for utilities, right? Everybody's about energy efficiency. Light bulbs are now consuming less energy, means less revenue for utilities. EVs are the biggest load, right? You add one EV in a house, and especially now with the battery sizes increasing, it's equivalent to adding another household. So it's a big revenue opportunity for utilities. So I think it's in their also commercial interest to help and move it forward.
Obrie, you mentioned home charging. How does that fit in to where this invested money is going to be flowing into?
I know that I don't know the exact percentages and the breakdown that will be going towards home charging. I know it's an important part of it. If you don't have a charger at home, it makes it very difficult to drive an electric car, and then that's when you start relying on public infrastructure. Again, I can just tell you my personal story. I'm on my third electric car now, living in San Francisco. I have a parking spot, which is very fortunate, but I don't have what we would call a level 2 charging station, which would be 220 to 240 volt. So I just plug into like 110 power, and the way that I've been able to supplement it is my local Whole Foods, which is basically a mile away from me, is where I would go ahead and supplement my charging. That's actually how my neighbor does it as well. And so again, we are prime examples of people who live in urban areas that are allowed to drive electric cars because of that. So.
Rajit, you wanted to add something?
Yes, so there's 3 key things about utilities, because we work with all the big 3 investor-owned utilities in California. They both serve on my leadership council, as does a utility in New York State. So first of all, they can sell more electricity if you drive more. Very simple. One more car, less gas, more electricity. Second thing is, when you have in California, when the sun is shining in the afternoon and they want to park all that excessive sunshine, they can park it in a car. The car need not necessarily charge from 6 in the morning till 7. It can charge from noon to 1 p.m. The one big advantage of a car is you can manage the EV charging. The grid operators like that. The third thing, the grid operators are very interested in looking at, and we've been doing some pilots on that, how can we use the battery inside a car for providing grid services? So I think that those 3 things are very important to the grid operators.
Now, for a car maker point of view, what role is home energy management and smart grid solutions playing for Lucid? And is it having an impact on your plans for the car and how your car is going to fit into people's homes?
Absolutely. I mentioned in my pitch that we are developing a Lucid home energy management system, integrating the car but also stationary storage upon customer desire. The key topic we are focusing in the vehicle development is, of course, making the battery capable of accepting the frequent charging and discharging cycles. That is kind of one of the key focus areas that you need to tackle in that sense. Other OEMs have batteries that degrade quite heavily over time and charging cycles, and we are working with our Tier 1 battery suppliers on new chemistries that we have tested and that are working perfectly for really long durability cycles. And that's core to making the car part of the smart grid at home, but also in the larger sense.
I'd like to touch upon something that Aubrey mentioned when we were talking about comparing the US e-mobility and charging infrastructure market compared so the differences between Europe and the US, and you mentioned that in the US there's hardly any charge point operators, or not as many as we see in Europe, or EMP partners. Can you talk about CPOs and EMPs, about their roles in the US and whether those roles are going to be changing in the future?
I think I kind of address this, but I do think that really, I think the shift is going to be that I think some of the automakers and some of the utilities and some of the others are actually going to really want to own that customer. And so I actually think that that's something that's going to shift. I mean, I still think we actually would call most of the owner-operators, we would actually call them EVSPs. So, I mean, I definitely think that there's a role, but I feel like things are shifting. And just to kind of put things in perspective, too, to understand the landscape, we may be in the US, and please don't quote me on this number, because there are some little CPOs out there that I probably don't know about. We maybe have a dozen, owner-operators of stations out there. I would say there's probably about half a dozen that are, fairly significant and have those some significant numbers. But I do think that there's going to be a larger EMP role for some of the others. So.
Rajit, you're looking skeptical. Did you want to say something about that?
Well, I think that technology is a great disruptor. I want to say one thing. I'm going to chime in on one thing. I think is people are going to chase the customer, right, to understand what the customer wants, what they're doing. So they're plugging in. So the EV charging station providers would want to own that customer. The utilities want to own the customer. Well, we haven't talked about the OEMs, the car manufacturers. Now, if you think about smart EV charging, when you plug in a car, who makes a decision of when to charge the car? Is the grid operator, is the site host operator, or the car owner? So I think that we haven't talked a whole lot about that, but I think that the car manufacturers are going to play a very significant role in this. So I think we don't really know what direction which it's going to go, but I just want to throw something out there. One of my PhD students, specifically 4 years ago, he took the software for managing EV charging to help the grid operator, the site host, and the EV driver. So he has 3 tentacles with all 3. So he started a company. The company is called Move, M-O-E-V, Inc. Go look it up. And he's trying to build his own little platform, and he's not the only one. Just in the incubator he's in, there's a couple other startups. So we don't know which model is going to win. I think it's a fair game. Who knows? It might be Google or Facebook. We don't know. But I think the key point is owning the customer is going to be critical, and getting data on the customer, doing the data analytics is going to be critical.
All right, well, one thing that seems to be increasingly important for customers is green energy, so that, that the energy used for everything, including EV charging, should be renewable energy. We're not quite there yet, of course. So, Dr. Rajit Gadh, what would you say are still the technological hurdles that we have to overcome so we can actually maximize the use of renewable energy when we talk about EV charging?
So one of my slides and one of my PhD students who's defending in a couple of months specifically built an app in UCLA in Parking Structure 9 to incentivize all the drivers on the 24 charging stations to maximize the utilization of the solar energy being produced on Parking Structure 9. So local utilization of that. And so he has the before and after experiment. And basically he's able to convince people to use more, about 20% energy that is locally grown in a sense, and also renewable. I think we're in very early stages of understanding. I think we're still struggling with EVs and EV charging and making things easier. So while it was a great experiment, how that actually pans out, how it scales, I think remains to be seen. But I think that utilities need to step in. And this is one thing we've realized, utilities need to step in to incentivize, number one. Number two, we have to make things very easy for the EV driver. We have an app right now. I mean, ideally, I want to just, ideally, the charging station should be able to plug and play and not have to do anything. So ISO 15118 as a protocol is an example that we're looking at. Plug and play, the car tells the charging station who I am, and everybody knows who I am. So I think that sort of technology is a little bit not there yet at some level. But I think we're getting there. Things are exciting at a pilot level. But the utilities have to play a key role. It needs to be very easy. I should not have to enter things on my app, which today we have to do.
All right, so talking about making things easier for people to charge, plug and play, as you say, I have just learned during the course of this conference about this new standard, the ISO 15118, that everybody seems to be talking about now, that's being introduced in Europe as a new standard. So Harmeet, do you think that kind of trend from Europe will make things easier in the US? Is the US ready to adopt that standard?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot of good things that are coming out of Europe, so we're very, very happy to take that innovation. So I'll taking a step back and adding to Rajit's point. At Greenlots, we've taken a position. It's very important that we do not disintermediate the driver and the customer from utilities or driver from the automakers. And that's not our role. We want to be enablers. And technologies such as plug and charge, ISO 15118, takes that a step forward. It really provides that ease, and it removes thinking points from the driver. You don't want to be fiddling with 10 different RFID tags or having 5 different apps, and just plug in and there you go. So absolutely, I think. Perhaps not all OEMs are on 15118 bandwagon, but then there might be other alternate versions of this similar technology. But eventually, this is where we see the industry is headed. And it's also, as you look forward, and we're headed towards an era of autonomous vehicles, and it's very important for. And this is ISO 15118 or plug and charge is one step taking us to that direction where we're automating the entire charging experience.
All right, so I see Obrie nodding a lot. Yes. So she, do you want to add something to how ISO 15118, is it going to really support interoperability in the US? Is it a game changer?
I think it is, yeah, and I actually agree with everything that Harmeet just said, especially I do think it starts to pave that path towards autonomous charging and really allowing those vehicles to get out there. The only thing I would like to say also is that it does start to pave the way towards smart charging too. There's multiple use cases, 2 of which are both bidirectional and inductive charging, and so it's going to facilitate that.
And what about from a car maker perspective? So is this ISO 15118 going to impact the Lucid driving experience as well?
Absolutely. As I also mentioned, we are conform to the CCS charging standard, which uses ISO 15118 as the communications protocol, enabling basically reverse power transfer, and plug and charge capability. So we are completely switched to that standard. For us, it's a tool, essentially. The user experience is the focus that we have. The standard is a tool. We will have infrastructure that is conform to that, where the infrastructure makes the decision whether to charge or not to charge is one thing. We want to give the opportunity to the customer, the owner of the car, to select whether he wants to make his car available to the smart grid or not. So that was a point you brought up earlier. We want the owner of the vehicle to be able to decide, but the vehicle is enabled and the infrastructure is enabled.
And Rajit, maybe we'll end with you because you mentioned the smart grid, and your institution is one of the leading smart grid research centers in the world. So what are your research center's key findings when it comes to smart grid developments in the last few years? Like, what can we be excited about?
Sure. I think that there's the positive side and the negative side, so that I sort of bring it all out, as a professor should. So on the positive side, I think I was really surprised how quickly people adopted electric vehicles, and you know, with the high tech, with mobile apps and smartphones, they've been able to, you know, move into it very, very quickly. On the challenges side, infrastructure is a challenge in adding a transformer. Imagine 252 charging stations were added by our center in the last decade. Adding a transformer, getting to work with the utilities, that infrastructure part is difficult. The third piece of it is that electric utilities, you know, they're slow moving, they're regulated, and I think we talked about that. So they can't move that quickly. But I think on the exciting side, we are getting a lot of data from all the EV charging stations that are out there in Southern California. That data is helping us understand how the driver is behaving, what they want, what they're looking for, what they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do. And I think the data with the data analytics, the big data, machine learning, AI, I'm really excited about that, how that's going to transform how we're going to build the infrastructure of the smart grid of the future to be able to enable large numbers of charging stations. To me, 100% EVs and 100% solar, 100% wind, that's what I'm excited about.
All right, let's have a warm round of applause and thank you to our panelists, Harmeet Singh, Obrie Hostetter, Rajit Gadh, Bach.